So yes, Mexican Americans definitely took part in battle, and because of their contributions to the war effort, there were certain effects, particularly on the farm industry and among farm workers in the U.S. All right, so what were the effects of World War II on farm workers? Okay, so first off, World War II brought about a high demand for food, not just in the United States but also in Europe, right? And so the farms had to increase production. They got to put out more food. They got to harvest more food, plant more food, and feed the world, basically, right? In a sense. And so that meant longer work days for farm workers, which in a sense is good for them because they could make more money. Right, and so you have farm workers making more money because of the war, because there's a higher demand for more food. Right, there's a need. Right, you got to feed the armies and countries that are struggling in Europe during the war. Right, so it's a war-torn society over there, and they need food. And so there's a big demand for food, but the problem is there is a shortage of farm workers at this time, at least Mexican American farm workers, right? Why? Because there's also a need for soldiers, right? And as I was saying, many Mexican Americans were joining the military. So with them joining the military, that left a shortage in the fields. So if you're going to try to produce more food, you need those laborers, right? Another reason why there's a shortage of farm laborers at this time is because of all the job opportunities in the defense industry. Like I said, many Mexican Americans are leaving the fields and they're migrating to areas like the cities where there's jobs in the defense industries, right? Now they may get discriminated against and they may not get those jobs at first, but that is going to contribute to a shortage of farm laborers because they're going to try. Right, they're going to make that move. Okay, so if you don't have a lot of Mexican Americans working in the farms, there still are some, but if you don't have as many as before, and you need a lot of laborers, where are you going to get your farm workers? Well, this brings us to the Bracero program. Let's talk about it. So the Bracero program was an agreement made between the United States and the government of Mexico in 1942. And the agreement was that Mexican American farm workers would be allowed to come into the United States and work on the farms, right? So it's a contract labor program. Right, so these are not undocumented workers. These are workers who have contracts with the United States to come and work under this Bracero program. All right, and so almost 250,000 of these braceros will come into the United States during this time and will be working on the farms trying to increase that food production. Now, farmers associations would try to take advantage of the Bracero program during this time. They would make major cuts in wages, so you would see wages being decreased at this time. Remember, the farm workers were organizing before this and trying to get better pay. Right? Remember, we talked about that farm worker organization, but some of those victories that they achieved would be dialed back because of the Bracero program. All right, so wages were going down. You would see the farmer associations trying to stop braceros from joining any unions so that they couldn't organize to fight for better rights. And you also see farmers bringing in undocumented workers, right? So the braceros, they're documented. They've got contracts to be here, but there's also undocumented workers being brought in to work on the farms, trying to increase that food production and make a profit during the war. Okay, that's what the farmers are trying to do. So they're taking advantage of the Bracero program. And you'll have Mexican Americans speaking out and protesting against the Bracero program for a number of different reasons. One, you still have Mexican Americans that are farm workers, right? And they don't like the idea that now they have to compete with these contract laborers that are coming from Mexico and undocumented workers coming from Mexico, right? So there's job competition there. There's the issue of lower wages. Like I said, like the achievements that they won were dialed back, right? And so now they got less wages. And also, you have Mexican Americans that fear that the Bracero program is going to lead to greater discrimination against them. Right? So if you have large amounts of Mexican workers coming into the country, there may be a backlash, right, from the white community, and that backlash may be taken out on Mexican Americans. Right? And so Mexican Americans don't like the idea that this could happen, right? Because they've been fighting for equal rights and trying to get rid of discrimination. But now you have this large influx of Mexican workers, and that might increase racism and it might get directed towards them. So that's why you see Mexican Americans speaking out against the Bracero program. Okay, so finally, let's talk a little bit about how Mexican Americans are fighting against this discrimination, right? Part of the reason why they're protesting the Bracero movement is because they're trying to resist discrimination during World War II. So one way that they were fighting it was to change the way that they're viewed, right? So this has to do with an identity solution, right? Changing the way that Mexican Americans are viewed. So one of these solutions is supported by members of LULAC. Remember, we were talking about LULAC before, an organization that started in Texas and eventually went nationwide. And so you have members like Alonso Perales. This is Alonso Perales right here. You have members like Alonso Perales fighting to change the way that Mexican Americans are perceived. Perales is a lawyer, and he was filing cases against job discrimination for Mexican Americans during this time. And the part of this change in perception that Perales was trying to promote was by referring to Mexican Americans as Latin Americans instead of referring to them as Mexicans. The idea that using the term Mexicans would bring up more discrimination and would have a bad perception related to it, right? Partially because you have the Braceros and a lot of Mexican immigrants coming into the country. So the idea is to point out that Mexican Americans are Latin Americans, right? And this also could be related to the good neighbor policy. Remember, the U.S. is trying to have better relations with Latin America during this time, right? And so you see this push coming from LULAC and people like Perales to try to get Mexicans viewed not as being Mexican, but as Latin Americans, right? So changing the identity perception at this time. Another term that would be used for Mexican Americans by LULAC was Caucasians, right? And they would try to get Mexican Americans to be viewed as Caucasians. So in Texas, you would see a resolution passed by the Texas legislature known as the Caucasian Race Equal Privileges Resolution. And this resolution basically was trying to end discrimination against Mexican Americans, trying to get equal rights and equal access to public facilities. Remember, there's still segregation going on in Texas at this time. And so the idea, the movement of LULAC here is to try to get Mexican Americans to be viewed as Caucasians or Latin Americans. Basically, they're distancing themselves from Mexican identity, in a sense. Right? They want to differentiate themselves from Mexican immigrants who are coming into the country, right? Hundreds of thousands in the Bracero Program. Right? And you have undocumented peoples coming as well during this time. And so, yeah, Mexican Americans are trying to separate themselves from Mexican immigrants. All right. You'd also see Mexican American soldiers fighting back against their designation as Mexicans. At this time, the selective services, you have to sign up for selective services for the draft. So Mexican Americans, when they signed up, they were basically designated as being just Mexican. So they're lumped together with Mexican immigrants in a sense. All right. And so you would have Mexican American soldiers fighting back against this, and eventually they would get that policy overturned so that they would not be referred to as just Mexicans in selective services, right? And so here you see this movement to try to gain rights and fight discrimination, but the way that they're doing it is trying to separate themselves from Mexican immigrants so that they would be seen as Americans and they would have equal rights along with other American citizens.